Paul Di'Anno has passed away at the age of 66, and for many he's seen as a kind of a peripheral figure to the stratospheric success that Maiden would later enjoy. But I think he's much more important than that, and here's why. Iron Maiden's debut album was very much the kind of template for that renaissance of this form of music in the early 80s, released on April the 4th, 1980 in fact. It was the only album to be produced by Will Malone, and it certainly puts down a very distinctive marker, I think defined by that raunchy holler represented by Paul Di'Anno. He brought an anger and a punk-like energy to this band, vital in the evolution of this band's early sound, and also vital in terms of this band establishing their presence within that new wave of British heavy metal genre, as it came to be termed. Jeff Barton in Sounds hailed it as heavy metal for the 1980s, its blinding speed and rampant ferocity making most plastic heavy rock tracks from the 60s and 70s sound a little sloth-like and funeral dirgy by comparison. Steve Harris, of course, was very vocal in his dislike of punk, but those early records are very ideally placed to hear the merging of those influences, punk and of course the more progressive aspects that Steve Harris favoured. This band, along with a band like Rush and Queensryche, are the forerunners, I think, of progressive metal. I think Iron Maiden actually went on to cover Jethro Tull's Cross-Eyed Mary, but it's this early sound that was so important to that burgeoning new wave of British heavy metal scene, and was nowhere apparent then on this band's debut record. That self-titled debut was brimming with hooks and attitude. Running Free is the first archetypal song from a band as they doggedly pursue this ambiguous form of freedom. But with Maiden, I think, and Di'Anno, it's kind of a raw, naive notion of freedom, I think, attendant upon youth. Very different, of course, from the motif of the never-ending highway in those Springsteen songs. Of course, no one in those songs ever really escapes, do they? It barely matters what freedom is, though, as Di'Anno convincingly sells the idea of going blind, arse out into the unknown is much better than the over-considered philosophical ponderings of somebody like Bruce Springsteen's notion of breaking free. And certainly in Running Free we get that gutsy chorus. But Di'Anno gives Maiden's crisp melodies and energy that would remain their calling card, I think, from which this band would then go on to build an empire. But prior to the release of the debut album, this band was struggling to get gigs outside of London. And of course we've got the release of the Soundhouse tapes, which were recorded around about New Year 1978, I believe. There were only 5,000 copies of these, and these certainly helped perhaps secure a deal with EMI. They comprised of 3 tracks, Iron Maiden, Invasion and Prowler, and those tapes were something else. It really showcases the more punk-like energy that this band had in the early days. There's no doubt that Di'Anno excels at these barrelling numbers, and his voice and presence would have been perhaps a little bit out of touch with the more progressive route that this band would take later on. But this was an important album, a game changer no less. When it appeared on the scene in 1980, it certainly ruffled some feathers, I think. But it was that famous Eddie figure, of course, on the front that established that iconic motif that was attendant upon this band's brand of metal. But that year also saw important albums from Motorhead, another band that were embraced by the metalers and the punk scene, I think. Saxon put out a very important album that year, as well as Angel Witch. But this album reached the UK top 5 and established Maiden as an outfit to watch, and also secured them a support slot on the Kiss tour. Kiss were promoting their Unmasked album, weren't they? And were a shadow of the feral band that they were when they were playing the Daisy in New York in 1974. They were bloated and alcohol and drug problems, all sorts of things going on. But they just morphed into sort of grotesque cartoon characters. Maiden must have seemed a very different proposition to them at the time. Maiden was certainly drawing upon more feral influences in rock music, not just the slumbering behemoths of Sabbath and the metal scene of the 1970s, and Di'Anno's influence on the music was immense here, as well as that raw sort of DIY production. I mean, the velocity of this music, tight, rapid, engaging and energetic, really announcing themselves. That's even before we get onto the vocals that were straight off the streets, that rough and ready growl that he had. Although Di'Anno was kind of visually the very antithesis of what we'd expect from a heavy metal frontman. A more never mind the bollocks vibe to him, I think. As I mentioned before, of course, compositionally, Maiden lent more into their prog influences, certainly by the second album. But even their shortest, most straightforward songs would deviate from the format of your standard metal number, and often featured abrupt changes in tempo and feel. The musicianship was far superior to their punk peers, and with complicated instrumental passages between guitarist Dave Murray and Dennis Stratton, and of course bassist Steve Harris. And the lyrics were also a vital signpost to what made this band special. And if I may quote Steve Huey's review, lyrics have similarly high-flying aspirations, spinning first-person stories and character sketches with flair for the seedy and the grotesque. Add it all up and Iron Maiden performed the unique trick of reconciling two genres seemingly antithetical to one another, using post-priest heavy metal as the meeting ground. The 7-minute Phantom of the Opera is a landmark, the band's earliest progressive epic, and still among its best, with its ambitious fusion of musical styles, its multi-sectioned construction and the literary retelling of the lyrics. It seemed to encapsulate all the promise of both the band and the new wave of British heavy metal. Of course, Paul Di'Anno is the co-writer of some of those early songs as well, specifically Running Free and Sanctuary as well, if I'm not mistaken. Please correct me if I've got that wrong. And of course, Running Free has been described by Paul Di'Anno as a very autobiographical song. Though, of course, I've spent the night in an LA jail. It's about being 16 and, like it says, just running wild and running free. It comes from my days as a skinhead. It was an anthem to youthful revolt that connected squarely with its intended audience. A 16-year-old who was out of money and out of luck. Well, I suppose it very much comes down to how you like your Maiden, raw, young, punky, or epic, complex and experimental. All these key ingredients were coming together that would certainly aid the juggernaut that this band would become. But I can't help but feel it would be almost very derailed at the very beginning had Di'Anno not been part of those early mixes, those early albums, and contributed to the band's fostering that live energy and live sound and rawness. In fact, the band themselves have acknowledged this. They've gone on and paid the following moving tribute to Paul Di'Anno. Paul's contribution to Iron Maiden was immense and helped set us on the path we had been travelling as a band for almost 5 decades. His pioneering presence as a frontman and vocalist, both on stage and our first 2 albums, will be very fondly remembered, not just by us but by fans around the world. But also, besides contributing those amazing vocals, I mean, Paul Di'Anno was an essential writing foil to Steve Harris, I think. Iron Maiden have called him a pioneering presence, and they were not wrong. Calvin Coolidge just famously said that no person was ever honoured for what he received. Honour came from what he gave. And what Paul Di'Anno gave Maiden was this power and ferocity, perfect building blocks from which this band would establish its empire. He was still performing to the very end of his life, and the fans speak very highly of him. And in an age of divas and fakery and pretenders, that means an awful lot. He was the genuine article, a bit of a rough diamond maybe, but he was our rough diamond, and he understood the importance of this, the legacy of this music, his legacy, how important it was to the fans and to the world. The writer George Eliot says our loved ones are never dead to us until we have forgotten them. So I suspect Paul Di'Anno will be with us for quite a few years yet. Anyway, you've been watching a video by Classic Album Review. If you've enjoyed this, please do share it. Do click like, subscribe, check that notification bell. Check some of the links below this video for ways you can support the sterling work done on the channel. It's always much appreciated. I hope you're well, hope you're staying safe, of course, and more importantly, that you keep listening.